Good morning and welcome everyone to the 10th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee this year. Please ensure all mobile phones are on silent and a reminder that broadcasting will operate your camera and microphone as usual. Please allow a short pause before being called on to speak to allow them to do so. Today I've received apologies from Andy Whiteman. Agenda item 1, we have consideration of whether to take agenda item 3 in private. Agenda item 3 is consideration of the evidence heard on Fair Rents Scotland Bill. For the record, the agenda also says the committee will consider whether to take agenda item 4 in private. The committee in fact took that decision on the 3rd of February, so there is no need to repeat this. As we're meeting remotely, rather than asking whether everyone agrees, I will instead ask if anyone objects. If there is silence, I will assume you're content. Does anyone object to taking item 3 in private? Thank you. I'll take that silence as acquiescence, so therefore we are agreed item 3 will be taken in private. Agenda item 2, the committee has taken evidence on the Fair Rents Scotland Bill. Today, 2 panels are our concluding evidence on the bill at stage 1. I welcome our first panel, Kevin Stewart, Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning, who is accompanied by Amanda Callaghan, Head of Private Housing Service Unit, Housing and Social Justice's Directorate, Yvonne Gavin, Legislation and Strategy Team Leader, Housing and Social Justice Directorate, and Craig McGuffey, Legal Directorate, Scottish Government. Can I thank you all for being here today? And for information, we've allocated about an hour for this session, and we have a number of issues we'd like to discuss with you. Some brief technical information before we start. There's a pre-arranged questioning order, and I will call each member in turn to ask their questions for up to 9 minutes. Minister, if you could please state clearly if an official has been brought in to answer any question. The member in charge, Polly McNeill, is also in attendance for this item, and I will allow her to come in and ask some questions after all committee members have taken part. We may also have a short amount of time for supplementary questions at the end. Could everyone give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak? And I invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
There is much that Pauline McNeill and I, along with other members of the committee, agree on. I share concerns in relation to rent affordability within the private rented sector, and I also agree with the policy intention of a fair rent for everyone. However, I am concerned that the drafting and approach taken in the bill will not deliver those intended outcomes. I also think that they could lead to significant unintended consequences, including increasing rents. I want to go through 3 particular elements that I have specific concerns about, Convener. First, the national rent cap approach risks landlords increasing rents annually to the maximum level permitted, so they do not fall behind market rent. At the moment, many landlords do not increase rents for sitting tenants and instead increase between tenancies. Secondly, national rent controls are also likely to act as a deterrent to large-scale institutional investment in the sector. Increasing supply and choice is vital to managing rent levels and ensuring that people have those choices. Finally, on the fair rent determination provisions, I believe these would result in significant financial implications for Rent Service Scotland and the Tribunal. There are similar financial concerns for national and local government in respect of the data collection requirements within the bill, with the financial memorandum not taking these additional costs and implications into account. I agree that more needs to be done, but it should build on the strong foundations we have already put in place. I believe that a national approach to rent control does not take account of nor respond to local market realities and nuances. The significant reforms that we introduced in 2016 provided tenants with greater security, stability and predictability in their rents, and introduced the principle of localised rent controls to target local areas with problematic rent levels. I believe that such a complex problem impacted by a range of cross-cutting issues, including housing supply and choice, household income, and the welfare system, needs a range of tools to tackle it meaningfully. And that is why, Convener, the Scottish Government will be publishing Housing to 2040 before the pre-election period, Scotland's first ever long-term national housing strategy, with an ambitious vision and plan for housing that meets people's expectations and needs, is greener and more affordable, and brings an end to homelessness. And as part of that, I am finalising plans for new robust rental data collection approaches to ensure that rent pressure zones can become a workable and powerful tool for local authorities to tackle unreasonable rents. I believe that reform is needed, and we will set out our plans to do so in this strategy. My position in relation to Pauline McNeill's bill has been to listen to the evidence and scrutiny of the bill. Clearly that has been curtailed by us running into the end of the term, though I have noted with interest the views of the two panels that were held last week. I know that this issue needs addressed, and it will be for the next Parliament and the next government of whatever shape that takes to bring forward their plans. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak this morning, Convener.
Thank you very much, Minister. We'll now go on to questions. And I heard your opening statement there, and obviously there's a lot of agreement about the outcome, about the creation of a fair rent and fairness in the private rented sector. But you've talked about the bill that's coming up. Is there anything you can tell us just now that the Scottish Government would be willing to take, or is in the course of taking, to address the imbalance between the tenants and landlords?
Well, I think there are a number of things, Convener, that I would like to point out. First of all, we have already introduced a range of substantial reforms through the 2016 Private Housing Act to improve the private rented sector. Most notably in all of that, the private residential tenancy came into force on the 1st of December 2017, which brought about the most significant changes in private renting in 30 years and gave tenants a range of new rights and greater security, stability and predictability in their rents, as I mentioned earlier. Landlords previously could bring a tenancy to an end for no reason, creating great uncertainty for those folks living in the private rented sector. And under the private residential tenancy, a landlord can now, of course, only use 18 grounds for repossessions, and tenants have a range of new rights that they can enforce via the first tier tribunal. The 2016 Act also introduced important measures to tackle increasing rents, including limiting rent increases to once in 12 months with 3 months notice required. It also enabled tenants to challenge unfair rent increases for adjudication by a rent officer, and it introduced rent pressure zones. I've been clear from the outset that I support the intention of the Fair Rents Bill. I think I've also been clear that there would be massive unintended consequences that arise, and the most crucial one being that a national rent cap could in fact lead to rents increasing, in particular for existing tenants. There are, as I pointed out, extensive existing rights for tenants, and I'm committed to highlighting awareness of these. Last year I wrote to every private rented tenant in Scotland to make them aware of their rights and the financial support available to them during the course of the ongoing pandemic. And we will build on the important reforms that this government has already made in our forthcoming Housing to 2040 strategy that we will publish very, very soon, Convener.
Okay, thank you for that. You talked about the issues around the data and registration. There has been some evidence that suggests that this may be an expensive process from the written evidence and what we got last week. But could you tell us, you've said that there's a system going to be coming in place. Why would your system be any less onerous on local authorities, for example, than the one that's talked about in this bill?
Convener, I've made no bones about it earlier. I think that the financial memorandum that accompanies Pauline McNeill's bill does not truly reflect the costs of data collection changes that would be required. What we need to do is to ensure that we have robust data collection in order to get all of this right in the future. I think one of the main issues that there has been in terms of local authorities and rent pressure zones has been local authorities saying that they find it difficult to garner the data that is required. The government have offered a number of local authorities help with that. Unfortunately, our offer hasn't been taken up. Now, I recognise that previous witnesses have stated that there has to be more robust data collection, and I agree with that. But we need to look carefully at exactly what is required here, work through a plan to be able to garner that data and have a system which will not be cheap, but a system which is capable of dealing with the data that we require, but also able to deal with any changes that may be brought to the fore in future.
So your issue around this then is not the proposal in terms of the data collection.
Does not take account of true costs.
Right. Okay. Okay. What seems to be something around? Okay. All right.
I just did some feedback there. I got a repetition of something that you were saying earlier, and I just wonder if there's a connection problem or if it's just me.
And maybe it will just be that everything I say you should listen to twice, Minister, but I doubt very much that's the case. There is some concern about data protection issues with the additional data that people are talking about. Do you have shared those concerns? And if so, is there anything that you think you can do to resolve that issue?
I think, Convener, again, this needs to be looked at in the round. I think that data protection issues can be overcome, but I think that we have to make sure that we get that absolutely right. And that's why I think that this is a piece of work that has to have a fairly intensive project plan in order to deliver it properly so that we don't fall foul of anything like data protection issues.
Okay. All right. Right. Thanks, Minister. I'll now bring in the Deputy Convener, Sarah Boyack. Sarah?
Thank you, Convener. It was good to hear, Minister, that you are reflecting on the 2016 Act. Would you agree that under that legislation, it's actually quite difficult for tenants to enforce their rights via the Housing Tribunal? That's been one of the common themes we've had from tenants' organisations and organisations talking about the reality for day-to-day life for tenants in the private rented sector.
Thank you, Convener, and thanks to Ms Boyack for the question. The government has implemented a monitoring and evaluation framework that is examining the impact and outcomes of the private residential tenancy on both tenants and landlords. The Nationwide Foundation is also carrying out research over a 3-year period, looking at both landlords and tenants' experience of the new tenancy regime, and that work will be independent of the Scottish Government's monitoring. Furthermore, Convener, during the passage of the 2016 Act through Parliament, we committed to undertaking a full review of the grounds for repossession after the tenancy had been enforced for 5 years. If it becomes evident that there are specific problems being experienced by tenants or by landlords, then consideration will of course be given amending the legislation if required.
Thanks for that. I mean, in terms of the evidence we've had on Pauline McNeill's bills, there have been concerns raised about rising rent levels, and the other issue has been raised about the quality of tenancies of the properties that people are renting. I mean, do you think that rising rent levels are contributing to increased poverty levels or unacceptable levels that people have to pay for private rents? We heard some pretty shocking evidence last week from the research that's been carried out about some people paying 50% of their rents, sorry, of their incomes for rents, and a suggestion that the system really isn't working at the moment and we do need change.
Convener, I agree that high rent levels can lead to increased poverty. I don't think anyone can deny the evidence that was presented by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation recently, which showed that child poverty in Scotland was a lesser degree than it was elsewhere in the UK because of lower rents here and the amount of social housing that we have. So, you know, I would not dispute the fact that high rent can lead to increased poverty. And that's why, you know, I share the ambition of ensuring that we put in place the right system to create fairer rents for all. I, however, disagree that a national rent capping policy is the way to do that. I think that the best way to do that is to allow for local flexibilities, as I've said previously. The rent pressure zones that were put in place in the 2016 Act have not been tested, and you know, a large amount of conversations that I've had over the piece is because local authorities think that the way that it was established was too onerous in terms of data collection and that it was difficult to collect that data. I believe that we can overcome that, and I believe that that is the best way of dealing with this situation, rather than facing the unintended consequences of a national system, which may unfairly impact folks in many localities if that were to come into play.
Thanks. One of the evidence, or some of the evidence we did have, was different rent levels at different parts of the country, and that we do have areas where we've seen significant rises in rents. But the 2016 Act was 5 years ago, and one of the things that has come across in the evidence to this bill is the fact that tenants are not able to use the existing mechanisms through the Housing Tribunal because they feel powerless. They're up against lawyers, but also not everything, if you take your landlord to a housing tribunal, potentially you could lose out and end up with a worse situation. So tenants aren't using the existing mechanisms. So have you got a response to that? And the issue I mentioned a minute ago about the issue of the quality of people's homes that they're renting, that they're paying a high rent for a poor quality home. That can't be right, surely. And is the principle in this bill not that that needs to be something that's taken into account?
Let me start with the quality issue first, convener, because we have been driving up quality in all tenures in Scotland in recent times. I feel that we should go much further, and we have done so. And if we look at, for example, energy efficiency performance, there will be more regulation that will come into play in the very near future to drive all of that up. I want to ensure that folks, no matter what tenure they're living in Scotland, are in a high quality home. And we will continue to look at what needs to be done in terms of those improvements. And I think one of the things which I'm very keen to do, as members are aware of, is to start doing all of this on an all-tenure approach rather than a social housing approach, a private rented tenancy approach, owner-occupier approach. Because I think that that's where we need to go, particularly when it comes to dealing with carbon reduction and tackling the climate emergency. In terms of tenants' rights and their access to those rights, as I pointed out earlier, I wrote to every single PRT tenant recently around about rights. I want folk to exercise these rights. And one of the things which I have had in the discussions that I've had with Pauline McNeill is a conversation around about this. I think that we could do more to publicise these rights. I think at the very initial stages of folks' tenancies, we could do more in terms of getting landlords themselves to highlight the rights that tenants have. And I am more than happy to try and improve on the information that is available to tenants so that they can exercise those rights.
That's a very useful answer. Can I go back to your opening comments, Minister, when you talked about unintended consequences of having controls over the private rented sector, and you said that Ms McNeill's bill would potentially put off large-scale investors. Yet at the discussion we had last week, and I should declare an interest on the register of interest given my former employment with SFHA, there was a discussion that actually the private rent sector is a last resort for so many people who need to rent a property or who want to buy but are stuck on an expensive rent because they don't actually have an alternative choice. So doesn't this bill need to fit into that wider context of having a proper set of controls over the private rented sector? And if that rebalances the market in different bits of the country, would that actually be a bad thing?
Convener, while I would agree that for some folks the private rented sector is not the right fit for them, and that's one of the reasons why this government has done all that it can to increase the amounts of social and affordable housing in Scotland. While it might not be right for some, the private rented sector is the right choice for many. And in particular, what we are seeing is an increase in folk looking at properties in the build to rent sector. I have to say, Convener, that I was quite sceptical myself around about the build to rent sector, and that's why I spent some time going south of the border to look to see what has been going on there, not only to talk to the institutions and the developers who are building these places, but also to talk to folk who were living in these settings. And I have to say that for many, many people, the build to rent sector was the right fit for them. And what we're seeing here in Scotland is the beginnings of development of the build to rent sector. And I'm quite sure that all members of the committee want to see an increased level of housing and also want to give people those choices. And while it may not be the belief of some, many people have made the choice to live in that kind of development.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to have to move on. Before I bring in Alexander for the next questions, Minister, can I ask you to keep your answers a bit shorter? We do have a lot to get through this morning, and I'll limit amount of time to do it. So, Alexander.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. We did hear from some witnesses last week about the Consumer Price Index +1 app was going to be too high. So can I ask you, Minister, do you agree that the CPI is a suitable index to use for rent, fair rent cap?
Can I say, first of all, Convener, that CPI is used extensively across government and the private sector, as it is considered the most robust measure of inflation. However, I do believe that it is a blunt tool that doesn't take account of variations in rent levels at a local level. And I think, there's a huge difference between dealing with this locally and dealing with this nationally. I think that, we all know that there are issues in certain parts of the country that are very, very much different from other parts of the country. I think the other thing in terms of Ms McNeill's bill is that given that ministers can adjust the number to any level that they like, including negative, this could be used to undermine the minimum increase that the CPI element provides. And in that sense, the use of any inflation indicator would be meaningless. Convener, I've made my position quite clear. I think that the way to deal with this is at a local level and not at a national level. And I think that as we move forward, we can improve on what is there in terms of rent pressure zones and get this right so that local authorities themselves can do the right thing for their area. And Convener, I should say that I'm pleased that a number of local authorities have agreed to be part of a future working group to examine the data collection that's required and rent pressure zones as a whole.
Thank you, Minister. So if we think that restricting annual rent increases to the CPI +1, that has impacts and it has the opportunity to deal with supply and quality of private houses within Scotland. So that index itself, as you've rightly identified, is relatively complicated and complex, but at the same time it does give us a marker or a gauge as to how things would sit. So do you think that that would have an impact on supply and quality of private housing in Scotland?
I think my great fear in all of this is that what we would see with the CPI +1% at a national level is annual rent increases, which would have an impact on the tenants. Whereas, as I said earlier, at this moment in time, there are many landlords who don't put in play annual increases and tend to raise rents in between tenancies. Let me also give you an example from my own corner of the world, because as folk are very aware, rents in the private rented sector in Aberdeen were once very, very high because of the oil downturn and Brexit and numerous other things. Rents had dropped fairly dramatically in Aberdeen. Now, one of the things which may also come into play is that landlords, in a situation where there's rent drops like that, may choose not to lower rents and may, in some cases, choose to keep the properties empty because lowering rents may well mean, that in order to get that back up when the market comes into play again, they can't do that because they've got that CPI plus 1% cap. So I think we've got to look at all of these unintended consequences that there are here. And I'm quite sure that by working together, because I think we all want fair rents, we can come up with a proposition at a local level which will work in areas for the benefits of the tenants in those areas, rather than using the blunt instrument of a national policy, which I think could have caused real problems for tenants in the future.
So, following on from that, do you think that the power of Scottish ministers to vary the application of fair rent addresses any concerns you have? And in what circumstances do you think that power should be used?
As I've explained, Convener, I don't think that any minister should be doing this at a national level. What we should be doing is looking at improving rent pressure zones and allowing the folk in the know at a local level to deal with this situation. Obviously, in these situations, as was laid out, there is some ministerial oversight, but I don't think that any minister would be in a particularly good position if they were lording it over a national policy, to be honest.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alexander. And I'll bring in Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. We've talked a lot last week about data, and I just want to continue that discussion. Section 3 of the bill talks about additional information that could be entered into the Scottish Landlord Register, like the monthly rent charged, the number of occupiers, the number of bedrooms and living apartments and so on. And I'm just wondering what use you think that would benefit the system of identifying fair rent levels. Where do you see the benefit of collecting that additional information?
In terms of data collection, I think that we could do much better in data collection. However, we don't have the system set up to manage to do all that is required in this bill at this moment in time. And in setting up data systems, that does not come cheap. And beyond that, as has been pointed out, there is often the possibility of data protection issues. In the bill itself, I believe that there are a number of drafting issues relating to the data collection proposals. Because while the additional rental information the bill proposes collecting would go some way in improving information on the PRS rental data, further information would be required to make this meaningful for statistical purposes. Indeed, the additional information would be necessary to complete the proposed fair rent determination, as if any tenant with a PRT in Scotland can apply, then the rent officer would require sufficient comparable evidence to inform their decision. There also does not seem to be a mechanism in the bill to allow local authorities to share the resulting data with others, such as the Scottish Government and Rent Service Scotland, etc. And section 3.2 specifies access to the register information, but would only appear to be in relation to enabling the public to request details of a particular property in a similar way to current legislation, rather than sharing the full data. I think the bill as is has a number of real problems, flaws in this particular area. But I do believe that we require to be much more adept at the collection of data, and that will be part of the proposals that we lay out as we move forward. But as it stands in this bill, there are some real difficulties there.
Are you able to highlight the method of collection that will be? Will it be through the landlord registration scheme, or will it be through the deposit scheme that people have to lay down? I mean, there's a real concern we heard last week about the rent levels, particularly in Edinburgh, and when asked about them, they were said there was no real data for rent levels. It was based on the asking price rather than the rent levels that are actually charged. And, you know, given the concerns in Edinburgh itself, how do we create a policy when we don't have live data that highlights exactly where the problems are and the extent of the problem?
Convener, I'm not going to be particularly specific around about how we need to do this at this moment, because I think we need to look at a number of things. But where I do agree with Mr. MacDonald completely and utterly, and our goal would be to ensure that we have live data, because live data is exactly what we need in order to have an accurate picture of the issues and the challenges facing the sector. And therefore, what I would say is that this bill does not go far enough in that regard. And I think we need to work through this methodically and appropriately to get this right. But my main point would be is that Mr. MacDonald is spot on correct, and what we require here is that live data.
Well, I appreciate that you don't want to say anything about the proposal that's coming out in the House in 2040, but are you able to say if there's any other data currently available that could be useful that currently isn't made available to the public?
I'll defer to one of the officials to answer that, Convener. I am unaware, but if we could maybe have Yvonne Garvin, please.
Yep, all of the data that's collected by the Scottish Government is currently published and in the public domain.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, is that you, Gordon?
Yep.
Right, thank you. Keith, please.
Thanks, Convener. Minister, you said that you had looked into the use of the public rented centre. I think you'd said you'd gone down to England as well to look at it, and you said I think it represented the right fit for many people. I think the evidence that we heard last week is that it's not the right fit for people at the bottom end of affordability, people that struggle. And I wonder if A, you would agree with that this does not, the sector, which I think I would agree is very important, serves a purpose, does not particularly well serve those who might otherwise choose to have social or affordable housing. And the issue really is about supply. If they had the choice to use other options, they would do that. And I'd say that acknowledging the huge steps that the Scottish Government has taken to increase supply. But is that an issue, or do you think it's the right fit for all people that are currently using it?
Convener, first of all, I said that I went south of the border to look at the the build-to-rent sector, not the private rented sector. And I think I should make that quite clear, because I think the build-to-rent sector is the right fit for some folk. In terms of the private rented sector, is that the right fit for everyone? And the answer to that is no. And we know that that is the case. We can talk to any of our constituents, many of whom are happy in the private rented sector, but many who want a social or affordable rent. And one of the reasons why this government has invested so heavily in social and affordable housing over the piece, including when Mr Brown was a housing minister, is because we recognise that that is the case. And what we are doing in terms of delivering those social and affordable homes is actually plugging a massive gap that was created through the right to buy and other daft policies, which reduce the amount of social and affordable housing that there is here in Scotland. So we will continue to invest heavily in the social sector, recognising the fact that a number of folk, many folk, who are currently in the private rented sector would much prefer a council or a housing association house. That's fair to say.
Thanks for that. Just on the point that you've made, and also witnesses last week made about rents and the mechanism which is proposed, the rental increase would have unintended consequences. My recollection is that the only place it would actually bite, if you like, restricting increases, is a small part of Edinburgh. And I think it's probably true to say that large parts of Scotland are a bit fed up when legislation intending to address issues in Edinburgh or Glasgow, and I'm well aware of the balance of the interest in this committee, is imposed on the rest of Scotland, and it's not appropriate. So, and it would actually result in substantial increases above what's actually happened till now. I don't know if you would agree with that, or if you think there's a wider benefit to the rental mechanism that's been proposed.
I would agree with Mr Brown, and where I've been involved in all of this, I've tried to localise solutions so that local authorities have a say in how that should be handled in their particular area. That's what I've strived to achieve in terms of short-term lets, giving local authorities powers because they know their own place. And that's what I would want to do here. I think a national cap here is a blunt instrument. I think that Mr Brown is right to point out that while there are difficulties here in Edinburgh and parts of the Lothians, those difficulties are not the same in Ayrshire or even Aberdeen at this moment in time. So I think that we should allow local authorities a say in this and to take cognizance of what is going on in their place in order to get this right for people.
Thanks for that. My last question is really about the issue of data, which we've touched on already. And I think the biggest effect of the proposed bill so far is to shine a light on the inadequacy of data that we have, and there's general support for improving that. And I note the Minister's previous comments. However, I did ask a question last week, and I think it still stands. What is to prevent? What is the big obstacle to having real live data along the lines of that mentioned by Gordon MacDonald? If you have, the IT solution must be there to have it, and if it has to be backed up by legislation, we could have pretty ready access to actual rent levels across the whole of the country quite straightforwardly. I know the Minister has said that they will look at proposals and come forward, but there's no real practical reason why we couldn't have a far more meaningful data set to base these decisions on, is there?
I am not an IT expert, convener, and I would never ever claim to be. I don't think that all of this is necessarily quite as easy as us non-IT folk think. and it will be costly. But what I think that we need to do is to look at how all of this can be achieved within the law to ensure that there are none of those data protection issues that have been mentioned earlier, to get to the point of that live data feed. I don't think that that is impossible. I think that that can be overcome. I don't think it's going to be necessarily as easy as some of us who are not so IT literate think. But I think we need to have the time to get that absolutely right. However, I agree with Mr. Brown and Mr. MacDonald that that is the ideal place that we should be, and that's what we need to aspire to.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Keith. And now bring in Annie Wells. Annie, please.
Hi, Convener. Thanks very much. Morning, Minister.
Morning.
I was just wondering, to what extent would the fair open market proposal result in improved conditions in private rented housing, given that there is already legislation governing private rented property, conditions and mechanisms for its enforcement?
Okay, I had a wee bit of difficulty hearing Ms. Wells there. I think it's basically around about quality. Is that right?
Yes, Minister.
I think, you know, no matter what, we need to continue to drive up quality in all sectors. And we need to ensure that as we move forward, we have housing in all tenures that are fit for the future. And as members are very well aware, as a government, we have continued to drive up quality in sectors. So we've had ISH and now ISH 2 in the social sector. We are moving in terms of improving energy efficiency even to a greater degree in the private rented sector. And obviously, we're going to have more interventions in the owner-occupied sector than we've had before. But one of the things which we have done over decades, generations, is that we have tended to put in place legislation covering one sector in response to something at that particular point in time. We need to be taking an all-tenure approach on this as we move forward. And that has been my aspiration. That's why, you know, the fire and smoke alarm legislation covers all tenures. So in terms of increasing quality within the private rented sector, yes, we will continue to do so. We have to continue to do so in order to reduce fuel poverty and to reduce carbon emissions. We're going to have to do that without doubt. I want to see that across all tenures as we move forward as much as that's possible. But quality needs to be driven up, and you know, we need to do that in terms of the massive changes that we require to reduce carbon and reduce fuel poverty.
Thanks very much for that, Minister. I was just wondering, are there factors that a rent officer or a tribunal would have to consider in setting a fair open market rent clear and transparent enough?
In terms of the... I'm having some difficulty in hearing you, Ms. Wells.
I think it's my broadband connection. I was just saying, are there any factors that a rent officer or tribunal would have to consider in setting a fair open market rent clear and transparent enough?
A rent officer or tribunal, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
And their role. Can I pass on to Ms. Gavin? You might have heard that a little bit better than me, and then I'll try and pick up, Convener.
Yeah, we believe the rental caps will over time start to distort the sort of true open market rental values. So we think that we would probably require further clarity and transparency in both roles. and that would require further examination in terms of what the bill sets to achieve there.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's covered Ms Wells' question or not, Convener.
Yeah, I think I'll quit while I'm ahead because my broadband is not very good.
Okay, thank you very much, Annie. Can I ask Pauline McNeill, member who brought the bill forward, if she'd like to ask a couple of questions?
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Minister, and yes, thank you for the engagement you've had with the bill so far. Firstly, I'd like to ask you, you said that the Fair Rents Bill would risk increasing rents, and I wondered why you don't think that would happen under rent pressure zones. As you know, that applied would be CPI +1, so that could be any part of Scotland. So your own inflation would presumably risk higher rents if you're saying that the Fair Rents Bill would risk rents being higher. So surely that risk is there, albeit on a regional basis, in your own legislation.
That is a possibility, and it would be localised. My great fear about this proposal, which is a national proposal, is that landlords right across Scotland would take the opportunity every year to increase rents by CPI +1, unlike what many landlords do at this moment in time, which is often to make those rental changes in between tenancies. So I think that kind of situation, that all Scotland approach could have very, very severe unintended consequences and could drive up rents quite dramatically in some places and cause some real difficulties and distortions.
So, but would you accept that that could happen? Say in Glasgow, they use rent pressure zones, and ministers agreed that, but surely then you'd have the same problem then, there'd be unintended consequences in Glasgow of CPI +1 in your own legislation.
But those would be localised situations, and stability, I think, would eventually come into play in those particular areas. But what you are suggesting in your bill, and as I've said previously, I'm in favour of fair rents. What I see is a real problem is that increasing of rents on an annual basis right across Scotland, which creates a huge amount of unintended consequences and distortions. And as Mr. Brown rightly pointed out, we know that in certain places there are difficulties in terms of rent at this moment in time. But there are other places where there are actually rent decreases at this moment. And I think, again, in terms of those decreases, they are less likely to happen if you have a national situation. And I would have worries around about that too.
Could I ask you then, Minister, so in Fife, rents last year rose by 6 times the rate of inflation in all property sizes except for 3-bedroom properties. Similarly in Argyll and Bute, I mean, you're talking about rates of rent increases of 13 and 16%, so it isn't just Glasgow. But my question is, why then do you think those local authorities haven't acted? And don't you think there's been a real failure of the current legislation? I mean, these are Scottish Government statistics on rent advertised. Don't you think then there's been a huge failure then? Because those local authorities are not using existing powers, and yet tenants are experiencing over the rate of inflation increases.
Well, I've been trying to encourage local authorities to look at RPZs. I've actively encouraged a number of local authorities. We've offered local authorities help in terms of the information that's required to put an RPZ in place. Unfortunately, no local authority has taken us up on that. I recognise that some of what is in play at the moment is onerous. And that's why I've said that we will reform that and make it much easier. But I do think, that localising this and allowing local authorities to put in place rent pressure zones, which may not cover an entire local authority area, but part of that area is the right thing to do. So, for example, you just gave me some statistics around about Argyll and Bute, and I'm making assumptions here, so nobody hold me to this. There may be a problem with rents in Oban, for example, that is not the same in Rothesay. Yet what your bill would do would make sure that that was Scotland-wide in its approach, whereas I would give, under our proposals, give Argyll and Bute the opportunity to do something in Oban, but not necessarily in Rothesay. And I think that that's where the main difference in all of this lies. And I think the more that you grow this, particularly into that national scheme that your bill proposes, the more unintended consequences that there are.
Just a last question, Convener. It was a follow-on from Annie Wells, which I know we couldn't hear too clearly, but in the bill, there's the right to a fair open rent be determined on the general condition of the property. So, for example, general poor condition of the property, any failure to meet the repairing standard, or poor energy efficiency. Minister, do you think this would be a useful provision? Because either it would improve the condition of the property, and we know across Scotland there are big issues about condition of the property, or the tribunal would have the power to reduce the rent to match the fact that it wasn't meeting the proper, I'm talking about legal standards, but general poor condition of the property being, for example. I thought, would that be useful to have?
Convener, sorry, I kind of cut off Ms McNeill there. I don't know if she finished or not. I apologise.
Do you think that provision would be a useful one for tenants, if you agree with me that there is a need to balance the rights of tenants and landlords? Would this provision for an open market rent to be determined on grounds with that? Because you don't have that in the 2016 Act specifically.
As Ms McNeill knows in the conversations that I've had with her around about this, I have a determination to ensure that we balance the rights of tenants and landlords. And for those tenants that are in poor quality homes at this moment in time, I want to ensure that they know their current rights, and that is one of the reasons why I've written to everyone in recent times around about their situations. I'll reiterate again, I have been clear that I support the principle that all tenants should have a fair rent. Let me go into specifics around about some aspects of the bill. Because first of all, the bill sets out that initial rent should be set by the market. However, the fair open market rent provisions mean that a tenant could effectively challenge their rent as soon as they move into the property. And that would be fine should a tenant receive notification from a landlord that they intend to increase their rent. However, I'm not so sure that that's okay if that's not the case. Secondly, in terms of the provisions of the bill, it would enable all of the potential 340,000 tenants in Scotland with a private residential tenancy at the moment to make an annual application for a fair rents determination, as the bill removes the requirement for only those receiving a rent increase notice from their landlord. And as it stands at the moment, only they could refer that to Rent Service Scotland. And as adjudications could only either maintain or reduce rents, there would be a clear incentive there for lots of tenants to take this up. I do think that there's more that can be done to improve rights on rent adjudication, and that's one of the reasons why I've had the conversations with Ms McNeill that I've had. But I don't think that the bill as is helpful in that regard. And again, you know, a huge amount of unintended consequences there. But what I would say to the committee and to Ms McNeill in particular, I'm more than happy to continue to have the conversations to improve the law for tenants in the private rented sector.
Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you very much. That completes our questions to our first panel. Can I thank the ministers and officials for taking part? And as you'll know by now, you can leave the meeting by pressing the red telephone icon. I'm now going to suspend the meeting for a 2-minute suspension for a panel changeover. Welcome back, everyone. I am pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses. They are Pauline McNeill, Member in charge of the bill, who's accompanied by Mike Daly, Principal Solicitor and Solicitor Advocate, Govan Law Centre, and Kate Spence, Researcher, MSP Staff, Scottish Labour Party. Can I thank you for being in attendance today? We've allocated about an hour for this session. Members will again ask their questions in a pre-arranged order, with any supplementaries at the end, if time allows. Pauline, if you would please state clearly if one of your supporting colleagues is being brought in to answer any questions, that would be very helpful. And could I please ask everyone if they could give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak. And Pauline, I invite you to make a short opening statement.
Convener, and can I begin by thanking the committee for making time for the Fair Rents Bill. Despite reforms, the private rented sector has been marked out by a lack of consumer power, particularly for tenants at the bottom end of the market, with varying property standards and affordability issues. The number of children in the private rented housing living in severe poverty has more than doubled in a decade to 50,000. And the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report that almost half of renters who have experienced a drop in income since last March are worried about their ability to pay rent. The Fair Rent Scotland Bill seeks to fundamentally even up the power relationship between tenants and landlords and create fairness by capping rent increases at CPI +1 and adding the right for tenants to have a determination of a fair market rent. Also requires the collection of data on rents to give a complete picture of rents across the country. The bill has widespread support and has helped create a catalyst for bigger and more radical change and thought about change in the private rented sector. I spent the last 3 years working out how I can make a difference to tenants who I believe would have greater protection in law. And thanks to Mike Daly, we were able to write the Fair Rents Bill. There is a consensus that we need greater housing supply of genuinely affordable homes, especially in social housing. But until we can achieve this, the Scottish Parliament, in my view, must use its power for change. I'd like to go through some examples of rent figures in recent times. In 2019, Greater Glasgow saw an increase in average two-bedroom private rent levels of 5.3%. This increase compared to CPI inflation of 1.7% of the same year. With the Fair Rents Bill, this rent rise of 5.3% would have been capped at around 2.7%. So it's been suggested that high rents is only an Edinburgh and Glasgow problem. I want to illustrate that that is not true. The latest Scottish Government rent statistics show us that between 2010 and 2020, Forth Valley and Fife saw average rent rises above the rate of inflation for all property sizes except one-bedroom properties. And last year, between September 2019 and September 2020, rental costs for 3-bedroom and 4-bedroom properties in Argyll and Bute rose by over 13%, and that is 26 times the rate of inflation. In Forth Valley last year, rents rose for 3- and 4-bedroom properties by 11%, and in Fife, rental costs rose by over 6 times the rate of inflation on all property sizes except for one. So a recent national survey, I know the committee have looked at, I think Rent Better noted that the most common reason given by tenants as to why they're in the private rented sector is because they're saving to buy in the next few years. And with rents rising above the rate of inflation in many parts of Scotland, it's proving increasingly difficult for people to save a deposit. So I asked the committee, how are this generation able to do that if rents are high, when rent pressure zones have shown that they have not been enacted by most local authorities? There is a clear link between poverty and high housing costs. And the survey I mentioned highlighted that over half of tenants reported that their housing costs were over 30% of their income. Single parents are also a group that are most likely to be struggling in the private rented sector. At present, the cost of keeping a roof over your head continues to rise in most parts of Scotland, with eye-watering rents in Greater Glasgow and Lothian rising at double the rate of inflation over the past decade. It is time for meaningful reform with a cap on rent increases and a shift in the balance of power to make renting in the private sector more equitable. Give this generation a chance in life by capping rent increases. Rent pressure zones surely be the same. Thank the committee, and for the time today I'll be accompanied by Mike Daly, who wrote the bill, and Kate Spence, our researcher. Thank you very much, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much, Pauline. You'll have heard the witnesses last week. You'll have heard the Minister today talk about one of the fears about the national rent rise is that the CPR +1 is that landlords might not reduce their rent in certain circumstances because of the fear of an inability to revert to their previous rent. How do you respond to that? And I accept what you've just said. This is not a Glasgow and an Edinburgh problem solely, but it is a kind of regional problem, if you know what I mean. It happens in Glasgow ourselves, as we both represent parts of. There's areas in Glasgow that's high rent, there's others that are less so. So how do you square that circle, if you will?
Thank you, Convener. I mean, I accept it as the central question levelled at the bill, if you like. But as you heard me put to the Minister, rent pressure zones also use the same CPI +1. And surely then, in the government's own legislation, you would risk the same consequences if that were true, because if you applied that to any part of Scotland, then landlords would say, well, if I'm only allowed to, if I have to cap my rent increase at CPI +1, then I want to use that every year. So it doesn't seem to apply to the Minister's judgment around their own legislation. Of course, landlords don't need to increase the rents, and often they don't increase rents. Lastly, I'd make the point that there is a provision in the bill to allow ministers to modify that, which I know the Minister criticised but I'm going to ask Mike Daly to address that question too, because we specifically put that in the bill so that ministers could, under delegated legislation, modify those provisions if they so wished. Can I call Mike Daly to answer that one too?
Yes, of course. Daly.
Yes, no, thank you, Convener. It's a really, really important point that you've raised, and I certainly welcome what the Minister has said in terms of his support of the intent of the bill. But he's right to highlight unintended consequences. If one looks at Section 1, subsection 2 of the bill, which would introduce a new Section 2210, as Pauline has said, there was the intent to allow ministers to make modifications and different provisions for different circumstances. But I think it's fair to say that in light of the evidence that's come to this committee, it's quite clear that there needs to be more agility and flexibility in that regard. And certainly I know that Pauline is actively considering how Section 2210 could be beefed up. So, for example, very briefly, it would allow for variable rent caps in different local authority areas. Now, that's the type of flexibility that Kevin Stewart, Housing Minister, has talked about, and I think rightly so. So we do need that flexibility. It could also allow for the Scottish ministers to give flexibility for those people, those landlords that don't impose rent increases for a few years, so that they are treated separately. And ultimately, I think part of the way forward is to have live, real-time rent reporting in terms of data as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. The point that I accept what you're saying, and the fact that obviously you're thinking about amendments for stage 2 and trying to beef that up, etc. But the Minister himself highlighted some of the concerns about the CPI plus 1 as a CPR plus 1 is okay for in those particular zones, and if there is flexibility to be done there. But why have we not waited until we see what the government housing policy is on this? Because it seems that some of the things, certainly your aim for fair rents is one shared by, I think, everybody in this committee, plus the government. Why did you not wait to see the Scottish Government bill, which you knew was coming down the track, to see if there was at that stage any amendments required for that, or maybe for a case for you to bring back a members' bill if like we're all hoping to be re-elected, those that are standing again?
Thank you, Convener. So I was elected in 2016, and in around 2017 I put my mind to looking at, when I've been housing spokesperson, many people wrote to me about the issue of high rents. So on rent pressure zones, what concerns me about rent pressure zones is that obviously we know that there's an issue about the data, and we know Edinburgh has tried to use the legislation, but it's proved difficult. But one of my concerns about the legislation, Convener, is that I think it's important that tenants have some rights here, and the balance needs to be, and I think there is some agreement among some, and I don't think rent pressure zones actually does that. So I put my mind to how can we balance up the rights of tenants. So it's the local authority's decision whether to take on, apply for a rent pressure zone. So a tenant or even a group of tenants can ask. They have no rights to ask the local authority to use it. They have no right to ask the government to use it. So where are tenants' rights in the current legislation? So, okay, so it might be an imperfect provision before you if you think that, but at least it does provide some certainty for tenants across the country. And with some modifications that Mike Daly talked about, it seems to me that it's more workable and balances up better the rights of tenants. I wonder if Mike Daly would like to add to that.
Mr. Daly?
No, I would agree with that, and I think just if I may, Convener, in terms of the whole point the Minister made about unintended consequences, I do think it's really important for everyone to be very conscious that the unintended consequences if we do nothing is we're going to fail another generation. And I think I watched the evidence session before your committee last week, which I thought was a very, very good session. The supply side economic problems are incredible in Scotland. we just don't have enough social housing for folk in Scotland, which is why we've had so many vulnerable Scots go into this sector. And I'm deeply concerned that if we don't take any action speedily, then we are going to fail another generation in Scotland.
I think there would be a general agreement with that if it wasn't for the fact that the government's already done a lot of work on it and bringing further work forward. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, I think, and I'll bring in Sarah. I might come back in later on, but Sarah Boyack.
Thanks very much, Convener. When we were in our previous session last week, one of the points made by several witnesses that there were lots of people in the private rented sector who would actually prefer to be somewhere else. I think you made that point in your opening remarks. They would either prefer to be in social rented housing or they would prefer to be able to buy their own home. Do you share the concerns that the Minister expressed that your bill would mean that potentially some of the big institutional investors wouldn't be investing in significant expansion of new private rent properties?
Thank you. First of all, Sarah, quite correct that for many people it's not a choice. And I note what the Minister said, that for some people it is, and I accept that for many people it isn't a choice because, as we know from the Rent Better study and other studies, people were there because either they would really like to go into the social sector where they prefer to be, or they want to save up for to buy. And if rents are too high, then you can see that, as Mike Daly says, you know, the generational, intergenerational issues here, I think, for the Parliament, considering public policy around housing. Yeah, I don't really accept that. I mean, obviously, I'm live to that. I mean, I wouldn't want to put legislation in front of any committee that would give me some concerns that we couldn't invest in housing. And I thought very carefully about that. And obviously, I've been discussing the proposals with John Blackwood from the Landlords Association, and we have a good relationship. We just disagree on a few points. So no, I don't really, I thought about it very, very carefully because I was concerned myself at the beginning. I've come out the other side believing, I think overall, I think we can get round this question. And I think if we make some sensible amendments at stage 2 and at stage 3, but I realise we might run out of time for that, I do think we could make it workable and not scare everybody about the consequences of investment in the sector. But at the same time, we can cap high rents, which are live across the country, not just in Glasgow or Edinburgh, and actually show that this Parliament has added to the existing protections in the 2016 Act. Don't know, Mike, if you wanted to add to that.
Excuse me, can I ask that unless there's a specific reason that we don't continue to bring somebody else, Pauline, because you know, there's a lot to get through, there is time. I'm not stopping Mr Daly from coming in if you think it's important, but don't always refer to unless you need to.
Okay, thank you.
You are welcome to come in this time.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, Convener. No, point taken. In terms of that question, I think Sarah Boyack is absolutely right. I mean, what I would say, and I'll try and be as brief as I can, the difficulty with the private rented sector is a tale of two cities. There are those who have got real choice, you know, upwardly mobile people that are moving around the country for work reasons and so on and so forth. And then there's the people that we see at Govan Law Centre who are in the private rented sector because they want to get into the social rented sector or they want to be able to get a mortgage, but they can't do that. So I think there's a supply side problem. I don't think the private rented sector in Scotland is a proper market that's working. I think it's dysfunctional. And what I would say is that when we have dysfunctional markets, what we do is we have interventions. So, for example, Ofgem was empowered to have economic regulatory powers for utility prices. When we discovered that payday loans were running amok, there was an intervention, so the FCA was able to do that. We've got a minimum wage floor cap, which is a cap as well.
Okay, thank you. Jenna?
Yes, thanks, Convener. Can I ask a couple of questions about the issue of rebalancing the relationship between private rented tenants and their landlords. One of the issues that's come up in evidence is the imbalance of power when you get to the tribunal, and the extent to which tenants are able to put their case and have an impact on whether they are actually paying a fair rent. Is it important in terms of the fairness that somebody could go to a rent tribunal and not end up having to pay an even higher rent? That would presumably put people off putting their case. Can we have a bit of information about how you think this section of the bill, in terms of implementing fair open rents, would actually work in practice? And we've talked about data earlier today, but what is the new impact that your bill would bring to these discussions?
Thank you. First of all, it was your witness last week, Professor Douglas Robertson, who brought to my attention that tenants could risk challenging under the 2016 Act a fair rent, and they would risk that the tribunal could impose a higher rent. So that's not an incentive to apply. I thought I'd deal with it in the bill. So that's what that section does on the part one on an open market rent. I do think that would be a useful part. I maybe need to have more discussion if it's worth it with the Minister around this, because I don't know if we fully understand the intention behind that provision in the bill, because I do think it's quite an important addition, because it could mean that the tribunal can't increase the rent, but they could reduce it. On the question of data, to me, that is the real point of consensus, and I take on board the points that the Minister made this morning, that there's definitely improvements that could be made to data collection, but I think everyone seems to agree on this, and it is certainly, I would have to say, was one of the difficulties in putting the case for the bill together, using government statistics and advertised rent. And although it might be, we need to look at the costs of that the Minister levels at the bill, but I think having data of rent would be really useful for everyone.
Okay. I've got time for another question.
Yeah, on you go. Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Can you specify what additional powers this bill would give that would actually be more effective than the existing 2016 Act? It's been quite interesting here today to hear the Minister talk about new changes he's intending to make in terms of data, because the rent pressure zones haven't worked. What are the other issues that you think are not in the current 2016 legislation that really this bill is attempting to address? And it could be to either Polly McNeill or to Mike Daly.
Mike, would you like to answer this?
Okay.
No, yes. Yes, thank you, Convener. I mean, I think what the bill is really trying to address, ultimately, to answer your question, Sarah Boyack, is fair rents. Because if you think about it, what the 2016 Act did, and don't get me wrong, the 2016 Act has done a lot of good things, but it just brought over the fair rent regime from the Rent Scotland Act 1984, which originally came from a 1965 Act, which, if I can say, was never about fair rents. It was only about the market rent. So when I've done cases on behalf of tenants, whether to the old Rent Assessment Committee or the First Year Tribunal, or I've argued cases before the Inner House on this very issue, the difficulty we've got is the law at present is the pendulum is swung completely in terms of the landlord, because the landlord has the ability to come along and put the rent up. And yes, the 2016 Act was good because it limited that to 1 time per annum. But when then when you look at the 2016 Act, what is a fair rent? Well, actually, it's an open market rent. So whenever prices go up, or whenever a landlord thinks, oh my goodness, I need to make more money, the tenant is at the end of the queue in this whole relationship. So I think what the bill does is actually, for the first time ever in Scotland, to try to introduce the concept of fairness, which has never happened before in Scotland.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Annie?
Thanks, Convener, and thanks, Pauline, for coming along today. I was just wondering, has there been consideration given to the danger that landlords might front-load the rent for a property which would restrict certain groups' ability to access certain accommodation in the first place?
Thanks, Annie Wells, for that question. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the issues that landlords have raised with us, is that if they were only allowed to increase rents by CPI +1, in many cases they wouldn't have increased the rent at all, and therefore they would just front load it, use it every year. So that is definitely something we've discussed with the group of or the Landlords Association. What we've said to that in the consultation is that we think there is a way to amend the bill at stage 2 that would allow landlords who wanted to freeze the rent and could show that for whatever reason that they had frozen the rent, there could be a provision introduced at stage 2 to allow landlords to recoup some of that. So, I mean, I'm live to that issue and given it quite a bit of thought, because, of course, we don't want the implications of the legislation to result in unnecessary increases for tenants. By the same token, we want landlords who do want to invest in their properties and to be able to do so. So if the bill ever got to stage 2, that's something I've already said to the Landlords Association I'd be prepared to look at. On this one, I would like to ask Mike just to contribute briefly, if he wants.
Sorry, Mike, I can't hear you.
Sorry, no, I don't have anything further to add on that point. I think Pauline McNeill has summed up the position.
Thank
you. Pauline, Professor Douglas Robertson argued that evidence on rent controls from other countries showed there could be limited impacts. For example, landlords in defined high-pressure areas can choose to ignore the rent restrictions, and tenants keen to secure or retain a tenancy choose not to enforce their rights, whether old or new. So I was just wondering, what evidence do you have from other countries that have implemented rent controls that work effectively, and how applicable are these models to Scotland given the different policy framework?
Thank you. So, yeah, I listened to that evidence. I tried to follow what was being said, and I don't know if I agreed with all of it. There are some countries where rent controls have been successful. So some of the countries I've looked at is Ireland, Denmark. There has to be said that some countries do full-scale rent controls, whereas my bill does have some rent control provisions in the right to a fair open market rent, but it's a cap on the increase on rent. And one of the reasons that at stage 2, and I'd said this in the original proposal, that I would be in favour of grandfathering rights, so that's to say that a new tenant taking on the tenancy would be able to enjoy the same rent and have that protection, because that was the experience that we had in Ireland. So we didn't model it on one specific country, but we took mostly from Ireland what we could see and examples from other countries. And as I say, because it's a members' bill, obviously, I mean, if you were in government, I mean, my view would be that you would go much wider and you'd have more rent controls, but that requires a much bigger investment in that concept. And so this is the focus that we came down to, was a cap on increases with that special provision, which is a determination for an open market rent.
Thanks, convener. Thanks, Pauline.
Okay, thank you, Annie. Keith.
Thanks, convener. Mr. Daly said this is a tale of two cities. I don't live in a city, none of my constituents live in a city. And Pauline McNeill mentioned the fact that Forth Valley rents had gone up quite substantially, I think. Forth Valley, as you'll know, comprises 3 different local authorities. So it's quite possible to have substantial rents in, say, Stirling, but none in Clackmannanshire. I wonder if Pauline's able to give any detail for the rises in Clackmannanshire, and also whether they're actual rises or just what the market is asking for. question kind of seeks to make the point which Pauline McNeill is making about the lack of data, but just to see how relevant this is to my local area, have you any idea what the rental position is in Clackmannanshire?
Thanks, Keith. No, I don't have a breakdown of that. I mean, it's one of the issues is the collation of rent statistics, which is why I put the data provisions in the bill. And I take your point, so that covers a number of local authorities, but you can see that there is a trend here, and I take the point that it's a big area to cover, so it might look completely different in different areas. So Kate Spence, who's with me, she's the one that has crawled over all the statistics and checked them all. I don't know, Kate, if you would like to come in and add anything to what I've said in answer to Keith Brown.
Yeah, the Scottish Government rent stats don't break it down to Clackmannanshire, so they say Forth Valley, they don't break it down to Clackmannanshire or any further. And I think that's again one of the issues, that there needs to be better rental data. And the Scottish Government rent statistics are based on advertised rents, and that is one of the issues that document brings up every year. They do note that in the document, and I think it gives even more motivation for needing better collected data. Better data collected even.
Thanks for that, and just for the avoidance of doubt, I completely agree with that. Live information is extremely important as to what you want to do. Just in relation, though, to, again, Mr Daly's points were about the supply side of this, which I agree, I think is the most important part, and yet I think this bill, in two of its respects, doesn't seek to address the supply side necessarily. It's the effect. It's not the cause of the problem, which is a lack of suitable supply, especially for those at the bottom end of what's affordable have. But it doesn't seem to address that. It just addresses the issue of the rents. And I'm a bit confused. If people are using the private rented sector so they can save up for a deposit to buy their own house, that doesn't sit with the evidence we heard last week, which says that some people are paying over 50% of their income towards their rents. I'm not sure how you can spend more than 50% of your income on rent alone and save money for a house. I suppose my point is that it's really down the bottom end of the people that I feel obliged to use the market. And isn't there a better way of addressing that issue in terms of supply?
Yeah, so I completely agree with you, Keith, that the issue is the question of housing supply. We know that from the statistics that show that a high percentage of people are there because they prefer to be on a social house waiting list, but they can't get on it. So they have no choice but going to the private rented sector, or they want to save for a deposit. And as you probably know, the sector has tripled in size since 1999. It's maybe one of the points that John Blackwood was making last week, which is, in his view, many of these people shouldn't be there, but you can see how the sector has grown, perhaps by necessity. So obviously, I've always, when I've spoken about the bill, talked about it in the wider context of increasing housing supply, particularly within the social sector. The thing about the figures, there is a level of complexity to this that doesn't always fit that easily together. So as you see, you've got figures of over half of tenants surveyed showed that 30% of their income was used to pay the rent. You've also got another group of about 21% who pay up to 40 or 50% of the rent. My point is this, that for that 21% who are paying almost 50% of their income on rent, they're not going to be able to move out of that unless the supply increases. So while they're there, surely we should be protecting them in some way, because we saw from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation figures, they are struggling to pay the rent and they certainly can't save for either a pension or a deposit. So I would say, to me, even if the legislation has a time limit on it, I mean, I wouldn't object to that, but I do think there's a need for urgency around it, because perhaps the pandemic has made it more acute, and perhaps the sector might get smaller in the future, who knows. But the balance isn't right, and if we don't come up with some changes in the next Parliament, if not this bill, I think we're going to run into more difficulty until we can give people more choices. And of course, for those who want to get onto the property ladder, and this is the generation that already suffered from the crash of 2008, who were basically far more remote from property use. And in fact, it's one of the issues around this, if you're interested in, around how wealth has moved away from younger people. And that age group is quite wide. It's people in their 20s to their 40s. So it seems to me there's a sense of urgency to do something, at least in the short term, 5 or 10 years, until we can, I suppose, grow the housing supply. I don't know if that answers your point. But
no, thanks for that. Just one final thing, which is, it's not quite central to your bill. I just wonder whether you and others gave this element consideration. Last week, I think it was quite interesting that we heard that the greatest level of investment in housing really comes from rentpayers, whether it's social rent to councils through their HRA accounts or capital accounts, or indeed from housing associations. So the bulk of investments coming from people on relatively low incomes, mostly, contributing towards rental, if you like, surpluses that then go into investment. Did you think about, in this bill, any way of tying in rents paid in the private rented sector to driving up standards? Or is it not possible, do you think, to do that?
Thanks for that question. I think it's a really key one. Yeah, I mean, any consultation we've had on the issue of quality comes across, and what myself and Kate Spence did regularly throughout the creation of the bill was to go on ourselves as tenants to see what the quality of the accommodation would be like and what the rents were. So last year in Lothian, a 2-bedroom property was £972. In West Lothian, it was £630. So you can draw your own conclusions as to whether you think they're high or not. But you could argue, well, at least if they was used to invest in the property. I suppose that's what part one of the bill in relation to an open market rent, I suppose, was trying to sort of drive at. So the landlord would take the view that if they might risk the tenant going to the tribunal to say, well, I don't have my rent's not fair because there's the property's in a poor state of repair, might be a catalyst for landlords to make sure that there was improvements to the property. But I recognise it's not enough, and I recognise it's an essential question. And I have to say, Keith, that in Glasgow, as my own patch, I was shocked, actually, at the high rents and the quality of the accommodation. I mean, I don't know anyone that has moved in to a property, and I would say this is in the social rented sector too, they didn't have to get their family in to help do the place up into a reasonable standard. So I agree with you that this is only a members' bill, so I'm trying to do as much as I can. And I'll be honest with you, one of the reasons, if it wasn't for Mike Daly, I wouldn't have got this far. I hope the convener doesn't mind if I put on record, and I will answer this as is a survey about members' bills. The bill team were not keen in me doing this because it had 3 or 4 specifics in it, where you probably know yourself that there's a tendency to favour bills which are smaller, so I recognise that. So we're trying to do more than that, and that's why I really value Mike Daly's input to this. But I think even if I could get some recognition that in the next Parliament, if not this bill, something much bigger has to happen to balance tenants' rights, to deal with better quality accommodation, and not, legislation that ensures that we get investment in property.
Thank you, and thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Keith. Can I just say that I suspect the non-governmental bills unit, to be fair to them, because of matters of time, would find it at a later stage easier to do smaller bills than one as complex as this one. Gordon.
Thanks very much, Convener. I want to ask you about data, but before I do, it was the point earlier on about investment into the private rented sector. Edinburgh has and I don't apologise for going on about Edinburgh because it's a major issue in Edinburgh, but Edinburgh Council has an ambitious programme to build 20,000 affordable homes over a 10-year period. And we've seen the population of the city grow by 13% over the previous 10 years. So there is a dependency on the private rented sector until all of these homes are built. but is there a danger that because of the rise of short-term lets, we could actually make the situation with trying to get a home in Edinburgh more difficult as landlords pull out of the private rented sector and actually move into the short-term lets, Airbnb, etc.?
Thanks, Gordon, for the question. Yes, I mean, I think there are, dangers to be alive to, I think, if you're going to legislate in this way. And I think it is possible to legislate in such a way that you do give comfort to landlords and investors. And of course, I totally recognise, I suppose it's where I started off, looking at Edinburgh's high rents and Glasgow's high rents, and discovered that it was beyond that. And of course, I know the committee have done a lot of work, and which I believe is in the right direction, the regulation of short-term lets to try and balance a housing need within cities. I mean, I guess this is something we can draw out at stage 2, but I realise we might not get there, to ensure that the balance of the legislation does not air the horses on investment and strikes that important balance. I would still say that it is worth taking some risks here, because if we don't take some risks in the legislation, what we're going to end up with is another 5 years of failed rent pressure zones, no balance for tenants, no enhanced rights for tenants, and on the grounds for eviction that the Minister talked about, I mean, I'm sure you've had cases like I have. Of the 18 grounds, you don't really require to provide a lot of evidence to evict somebody. I mean, I had a couple who came to me and said, well, we've been asked to move out because the landlord's brother wants to move in, but there's no testimony as to that's all you have to provide. So I do think that in the next Parliament, it's worth taking some risks to try and get that balance right, but not so huge risks as we scare off investors. And I suppose that's government job, is to try and ensure that in the balance of creating more tenants' rights and regulation of short-term lets, that we have a proper housing system that works for everyone. Okay.
So moving on to the data, Section 3 suggests that we collect a lot more data, and while I fully understand the need to collect monthly rent data because it would give us that live data we're all looking for, you've also got suggestion that it should be the number of occupiers, number of bedrooms, etc. Could you just say what the benefit of collecting that data would be?
I will ask Mike Daly in this one as well, if it's okay, convener, but I'll begin with, thanks for the questions you've asked on this. Gordon followed the committee last week because I think the collection of data I may not have it perfectly right in the bill, so let me just say that. I heard the Minister about sharing of the data. I know that was a good point that he made there. One thing I'm absolutely clear about is that we do need data so that we know what we're dealing with, and we can break those statistics down, as Keith Brown asked me to do, which I wasn't able to do. I think there's cross-referencing with other legislation that exists about specifying the number of occupants. On this one, Mike, could I ask you to come in on that one?
Yes, no, thank you, convener. In terms of occupiers, I think if the bill was to progress to stage 2, that could be removed, because ultimately HMO legislation, as Pauline has alluded to, intersects with that. But I think certainly the Minister had given evidence this morning to say that he had some concerns, Mr MacDonald, with the Section 3 of the bill in terms of data and data protection and so on and so forth. I have to say, I didn't understand the Minister's position, because all that Section 3 of the bill does is add some additional data fields, if you like, to the existing private landlord register, which is all under the Antisocial Behaviour Exception Scotland Act 2004. Now, the 2004 Act is used and it underpins the landlord registration scheme in Scotland, and it has worked a treat in that respect since 2004. So the ability to have, and I'd said this at the outset, Pauline McNeill's very sympathetic to, and I think there's a consensus, that we need real-time data. And I think real-time data is not that onerous, because it would only be if the landlord changes the rent, which they can only do once per annum, that they would have to report that to the local authority. But if we had that information, that would be tremendous in terms of the ability for local authorities and Scottish Government, and indeed tenants and landlords, to be able to know exactly what's going on.
Okay. In terms of the collection of that data, it would happen at the point of registration or every 3 years at the point of re-registration. Is there a danger that it's out of date?
Yeah, I think that's one of the divisions. I think probably that we would make, it probably makes sense to collect it on an annual basis so that it isn't out of date, but I appreciate that. I suppose we'd have to look at the detail of how that could be done efficiently without huge costs, and I believe it can be. And again, I wasn't clear where the Minister was going with it, as I thought he was sympathetic to the idea we should have some system to collect regular data on rents. Otherwise, none of us will know what kind of policies decisions that we would want to make around housing. So I think it would make sense to collect that every year.
I mean, I agree that we need that level of detail, but how would you do it without it being an increased workload on councils, and that may not necessarily have the right level of resource? What would be the most efficient way of collecting that data? Is it just the registration scheme, or as some people have suggested, the deposit scheme, or what would it be?
In my view, it should be the Scottish Landlord Register. I don't support the view that it's too onerous at all. I think that's the least we can do. I mean, to me, that would be the obvious way to do it. But again, if the committee were able to scrutinise it further, I'm open to the best way of collecting this evidence. When I looked at it, I thought it's quite an obvious place to start is the Scottish, albeit that that's every 3 years. So I think maybe we need to look at how we would do it every year. So I recognise that's something to be fixed. But the idea that it was so onerous that we couldn't do it through the Landlord Register. And by the way, I remember when the landlord registration provision was brought in, and to my recollection, that it was opposed by some landlords as well. So, I mean, we can't do nothing. I mean, based on the critique of the bill, it's too difficult to collect the data, and RPZs are already there. We fixed it in the 2016 Act. I mean, really, we might have some differences about the detail or maybe the impracticalities. It's a proposal at stage 1. In any bill, you would do a lot at stage 2. You can do a lot at stage 2, but I don't accept it's too onerous at all. I think this is the least we can do, and I've really urged the committee to look at it. If you find another way of doing it more efficiently, then I would be full support of that.
And finally, what's your views about concerns that have been raised about data protection?
Yes, I think the landlords have expressed a concern. They wouldn't want everyone to see what rent they were charging. I mean, initially my thought was that the data should be collected by a local authority, and so that we wouldn't be, you wouldn't be publishing the specifics of the landlord, but just where the rents were, in order to have the data. So I'm no data expert. I would say that I've had been a number of people who do collect data have been in contact with me. So that's maybe those are collect data for social security purposes to look at housing allowance. I'm very keen on this, because they find it very, very difficult to provide the DWP with that information. So yeah, I think I wasn't wanting a whole list of landlords published in the public domain. I'm very alive to that's information that why should be published. I really just want the rents published against the size of the property, and that's what I would be really looking for in any system.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Alexander.
Thank you, Convener. Many questions have been asked, but if I could just ask a couple towards the end of the session. Pauline, the mechanisms for tenants to apply for a fair rent is clear, but what about the accessibility and user-friendliness of it all? How do you see that progressing?
Well, I think that's a great question, actually, because providing advice to tenants on how they take their questions forward is a central question, and we know that the lack of advice centres, of course, has resulted in people not taking up their rights. Actually, it's maybe better if Mike Daly answers this, because one of the great things about having Mike is because he also is the main advocate of government law centres, so he's tenants all the time, which he can advise. But as what you're getting at is that there's a lot of unmet need. How do people know their rights? And how do they access them? Going to a tribunal is a scary thing for a lot of people. So can I ask Mike Daly to come in? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I mean, that's a really, really important question that you asked, Mr. Stewart, because it's interesting. What we've done, and I'm not quite sure that we've got any sort of research on how wellness has worked, but with simple procedure in the Sheriff Court for lower value claims, we've made that an online process. So it starts off as an online process initially. And so in terms of making things easier for tenants, certainly I think we should use digital technology to a greater extent, but also bearing in mind, of course, that there are many people, particularly very vulnerable people, who are digitally excluded. I mean, I'm conscious that over the last 20 years, the number of older people that are in the private rented sector has doubled. And of course, last year, Scottish Widows produced a report showing that they expected that people retiring and being in the private rented sector would be spending 42% of their pensions on rent. So we need to make things easier for people, but I think we can do that with technology, and I think we've got some experience from the Scottish court system. But I also think we need to be very mindful of those that are digitally excluded, which is why having local advice agencies that can provide free support and advice, whether it's law centres, CEDs, so on and so forth, is so important.
And you identify that the older age group who do not have the same accessibility or opportunity require that assistance and support to ensure that they do understand what they're entitled to, what their rights are, and where they can actually access any issues that they have. Because they may not be aware, and because they're not aware, then they don't challenge that, or they don't want to seek any more relevant information because, as I say, they may be unaware of what their entitlements are. So you've identified what needs to be done, but that comes at a cost. How do you see that being processed?
Well, I think in terms of coming at a cost, I was certainly encouraged by the Housing Minister's evidence earlier, because it struck me that Mr. Stewart was very sympathetic to tenants in the private sector being made aware of their rights. And I got the impression the Scottish Government was very keen to do more in that space, and certainly Government Law Centre and many others would be very happy to work with the Minister in that regard, because I do think the cost in terms of that, promoting those rights and providing the support, should be bared by the public purse. And if you think about it, we do have a very strong network of free advice agencies that are funded ostensibly through the public purse, that are in a good position in Scotland to help the kind of people that Mr. Stewart's talking about. So I certainly agree that we need to do much more, and I was encouraged, as I say, by the Minister's willingness to actively look at that.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of this session and concludes the public part of the meeting. But before I go, can I just say that no matter what happens now, I'd like to put on record my thanks to Pauline McNeill and her team for the work they've done bringing this Members' Bill forward. If it has certainly raised the consciousness of the idea of fair rents again, and a lot of good work's went into it. So thank you very much for your time. You know how to leave the meeting. As always, press that red button and you disappear from our screens. As for the rest of us, we will go into private session. I propose we resume the meeting in 5 minutes, and please accept the clerk's meeting request for the private discussion, which will be sent shortly. I suspend the meeting and thank you again.